Hello friends, Paper Historian here. I'm glad to welcome you to my channel, where we don't just tell stories, we walk the dust-choked roads alongside those who lived them. In today's video, we'll follow a knight who has seen more deserts than dreams, more sieges than sunsets, and who finds himself called to yet another crusade long after he thought he'd hung up his sword for good. So, settle in. Let the clink of armor and the creak of saddle leather fade into the background, and let's take our time, because this road is long, and the dust remembers everyone who's walked it. You wake before dawn, not because you want to, but because the bell says so, and the bell is less forgiving than God. Sleep, after all, is for peasants, merchants, and other people whose souls aren't on layaway with the Almighty. You rise in the dark, your blanket stiff with the chill that seeps into every stone of the barracks. And you say your prayers with a mouth that still tastes like last night's boiled lentils, a taste that even the devil might consider cruel. Your brothers kneel around you in silence, their heads bowed, their minds perhaps on scripture, perhaps on breakfast, perhaps on the fact that their armor has been slowly rusting since the last time someone remembered to oil it. The Templar Day begins in a way that would make a monk proud and a soldier irritated in church. The chants echo in the cold air, each note wrapping around your ribs like a reminder that you are not here for comfort or wealth, or even glory. You are here because someone decided that killing in the name of God counts as a good deed, and you happen to agree at just the wrong moment in your life. The prayers are long, the bench is hard, and the candles burn low, but the rhythm of it settles in your bones like a drum beat you can't unhear. When the service ends, there's no lingering to gossip, no time to shuffle slowly toward the mess hall. Discipline is the mortar between the stones of your order, and breaking it would be like pulling a brick from the wall while still living inside it. So you march to the refectory, where the bread is yesterday's, the cheese is last month's, and the water is today's only because the well is too stubborn to dry out. If you are lucky, someone remembered to throw peas into the pot. If you are unlucky, someone remembered to throw barley instead. You eat without complaint, because complaint is for men with options, and you traded yours for a white mantle and a red cross. After breakfast, the real work begins. Training, inspections, chores that feel suspiciously like penance. You polish your sword until your reflection stares back at you in disappointment. You mend straps, oil hinges, and check the edge on your dagger, even though you hope not to need it before lunch. There are horses to tend to, each one with more personality than the men you live with, and infinitely more likely to kick you if displeased. You curry their coats, check their hooves, whisper reassurances you don't believe. A warhorse is a more valuable asset than any single knight, and in some campaigns, you've suspected the commanders believe this in their bones. The master of the order walks past now and then, his gaze sweeping over you like a man checking for cracks in the wall. He says little because words cost time, and time costs discipline. And discipline is the only currency the Templars trust more than gold. When he does speak, it's to remind you that idleness is a door through which Satan walks in without knocking. You don't tell him that exhaustion is also a door because sarcasm is not part of the Templar rule. And you've no interest in scrubbing latrines for the rest of the week. By mid-morning, the sun is warm enough to soften the frost, but not the mood. Orders come down to drill in formation, because even in the absence of Saracens on the horizon, the order believes an unpracticed sword arm is an invitation to disaster. You line up, you march, you wheel left and right at the bark of a command. You thrust and parry against invisible foes until your shoulders burn and your palms ache. The younger brothers move too quickly, eager to prove themselves, their blows wild and their breathing ragged. The older ones pace themselves, saving strength for a fight that may come in a month or in an hour. Then, as the sun climbs higher, you shift from martial readiness to the more subtle arts of survival. For a Templar in the Holy Land, that means maintaining your kit as though your life depends on it, which it does. Sand works its way into everything here. Armor joints, saddle straps, the hinge of your helmet's visor. It will grind away the edge of your sword, and the patience in your soul. You work methodically, mindful of the rule's insistence that your arms and armor remain serviceable at all times, because nothing embarrasses the order quite like a knight undone by a broken buckle. Lunch is no feast, but compared to breakfast, it might as well be. Lentils again, perhaps a sliver of salted fish if the supply ships have been generous. Bread, always bread, so hard you could train with it if the need arose. There is no wine, that is for lords and sinners, only water or watered vinegar, which somehow manages to quench thirst while still tasting faintly like regret. Meals are eaten in silence while a brother reads aloud from scripture or from the rule, reminding you between bites that your life is not your own and your flesh is merely a sheath for the soul you've promised to God. Afternoons are for tasks dictated by necessity rather than glory. Sometimes it's fortifying walls against the desert wind. Sometimes it's escorting a caravan of pilgrims so green they still believe the Holy Land is about piety rather than commerce. You have seen their type before, eyes wide, lips moving in prayer, pockets full of coins they think will last them to Jerusalem and back. You and your brothers ride ahead and behind, scanning the hills for movement, your hand never far from your sword hilt. It's tedious mostly, but tedium is preferable to the chaos that comes when the enemy decides to test your vigilance. If you are not on escort duty, you might be in the infirmary, because knights break almost as easily as pottery when enough force is applied. You have learned to stitch wounds, to set bones, to pray over fevers with equal fervour, because sometimes prayer is all you have left. You've buried brothers too, not in grand tombs, but in shallow graves outside the walls, marked only by a cross and the memory of a few who still cared enough to remember their names. Death here is not an event, but a companion. As the sun begins to fall, the evening bell calls you back to prayer. Vespers is less about piety and more about recalibration, a reminder that tomorrow will look much like today and that monotony is a kind of armor in itself. After the service, the evening meal appears, identical to the midday one, unless fortune or charity has intervened. There are no long conversations, no bawdy songs like you've heard in other garrisons. The Templar life does not leave room for indulgence. Even laughter feels like contraband. Night comes early, not because the sun has set, but because the order says it's time. You return to your narrow bed, your sword within reach, your boots close enough to pull on in the dark. You lie there, listening to the breathing of the other men, the occasional snort from the horses in the stables below, the faint hum of the wind against the walls. Sleep does not come quickly. It rarely does. Your mind wanders, to battles fought, to ones yet to come, to the possibility of never seeing home again. You remind yourself that the rule forbids fear. Then you remember that the rule also forbids vanity. And yet here you are, wearing a cross large enough to be seen from the next kingdom. Eventually, fatigue drags you under. It is not restful sleep, but it is enough. It has to be, because tomorrow the bell will ring again, the prayers will rise again, and you will march out once more into a world that cares nothing for your vows except to test them. And you will endure, because that is what the order requires, and because you no longer remember how to do anything else. And you will endure, because that is what the order requires, and because you no longer remember how to do anything else. Food, which once meant celebration, now means arithmetic. A Templar does not eat to be pleased. You eat to remain an instrument. Bread first, big loaves baked in field ovens whose chimneys cough like veteran troopers. The crust threatens teeth and reputations alike. The interior tastes of smoke and the last town whose mill remembered you when you knocked. Pottage second, lentils or chickpeas cooked to a consistency best described as obedience. On merciful days there's garlic and a dream of olive oil, a pinch of cumin bought from a merchant who swore on 3 different gods that it wasn't sawdust, cheese, salt fish, if the barrel survived the voyage, dried figs when somebody's cousin in Tripoli owed somebody's uncle a favour. Meat is not forbidden, just rationed by a logic more theological than nutritional. 3 days a week if the quartermaster's conscience allows it, and never so much that you forget humility. The water is an ongoing negotiation with both providence and plumbing. Wells taste of iron, cisterns of last month, skins of the animal they used to be. You learn the habits of thirst like a second catechism. Sip early, sip often, never finish, never boast. Wine exists in theory, but the rule distrusts it, the way the rule distrusts anything that might make a man think he is interesting. When it does appear, it is biblical, meaning watered until the Almighty himself would ask for a refill. You share everything. That is not a metaphor, it's an inventory practice. Your knife is yours only until a brother misplaces his. Your blanket becomes 2 blankets when a new recruit arrives with more zeal than equipment. Your patience is communal property from the hour you take vows until the hour you die, and someone else inherits your insomnia. The order does not do mine, except when it comes to sin and wounds. Those you keep. Armour is both habit and habitat. Gambeson first, a quilted thing that smells like a farm and feels like penance. Over it, hauberk, ring by ring, obedience stitched into steel, sleeves that bite when sweat turns the mail into a second skin. Chausses for the legs, because apparently God gave you arteries down there too. Over all that, surcoat, the white mantle marked with a red cross that announces to friend and foe alike that you intend to be both stubborn and visible. Helmets are an argument between airflow and survival. The open nasal for days you need to breathe, the barrel helm for days you need to not die. Every choice has a sermon attached to it. Most sermons end in blisters. Horses complicate everything. The destrier thinks with his shoulders and forgives you if you think with yours. The palfrey has opinions about sand. The rouncy will carry anything, including your dignity, when the world falls apart. You learn their moods better than you learn the psalms, because you can fake a psalm and you cannot fake a trot over broken ground. Oats are currency, barley is insurance, water is sacred, and a loose shoe can doom more souls than a heretic with a printing press. The farrier is a saint in a leather apron, and you have said more prayers toward his anvil than toward any altar in a storm. There is commerce in the Holy Land, and there is commerce. The first sells spices, cloth, tools, dates so sweet they forgive the desert, soap that refuses to admit it is perfume. The second sells information, which is heavier and noisier, but packs better. Which gate is opened late? Which emir has a cousin who hates him just enough? Which well went bad after last winter's rain? And which cistern requires a bribe measured in wool rather than coin? You learn Arabic badly and Frankish better, and the international language of shrugging best of all. The people you protect live by markets. The people you fight live by markets. You live by rules and learn to pretend you don't notice that food, horses, and silence all cost. Ceremony intrudes at inconvenient times, which is to say, it happens exactly when you would rather be asleep. On days of particular solemnity, the commandery stages a chapter. Brothers kneel, confess, accept penances that range from extra guard duty to fasting, to the social humiliation of eating on the floor while everyone else uses the table. The purpose is not shame, the purpose is repair. A ship leaks, a man sins, a wall cracks. The order knows only one solution: more mortar. You submit because resistance is inefficient and because, embarrassingly, the ritual works. Once a week, you are sent to the market not for buying, but for being seen. Visibility is its own kind of weapon. A white mantle in the crowd chases certain temptations back into their stalls. You keep your eyes down as a courtesy to your vows and up as a courtesy to your continued existence. A fisherman sells you news with fish attached. A baker smirks as he offers flatbread that tastes of ash and victory. A boy runs past dragging a kite shaped like a bird that no one has the heart to confiscate, even though hawking is forbidden, and the rule, as written, could probably make a case against paper birds. Your enemies, when they appear, do so either as mirage or thunderclap. Skirmishes are sudden, precise insults hurled across a strip of ground both sides have already memorized. Arrows hiss, horses scream, men perform the only kind of mathematics anyone here respects, which is the subtraction of space between two blades. You have learned to fear not the charge, but the hour after it, when confusion pretends to be victory and men die as an afterthought. Women wail in languages you cannot read and do not need to, because grief has grammar, cadence, tense, and it translates flawlessly into regret. In quieter moments, there is maintenance masquerading as piety. You help clean the chapel, replacing waxy candles with waxier ones, scraping soot from icons that have seen more tears than artists. The brother reader intones a chapter of the rule during meals. You memorize it not by conviction, but by repetition, until, inconveniently, conviction shows up, later disguised as habit. You polish the altar candlesticks the way you polish your spurs, with the same small pride and the same embarrassed diligence. Metals do not care for what purpose they shine. They demand to be shined. Sickness is an army with better logistics than yours. Dysentery whispers doctrine in latrines. Fevers draft men without asking. Wounds collected in glorious fury fester later in ignoble quiet. Vinegar is the universal sacrament of cleanliness. Wine would be better, but wine is rationed, and vinegar is honest. The infirmary keeps a ledger as if souls could be accounted for by tally marks. He has a cauldron that smells like 3 different kinds of hope and a brazier that glows the color of resignation. He teaches you to boil your bandages and your pride. When a brother dies, and a brother always dies, you strip his gear for the order before you say prayers for his soul, because souls can wait and spoils attract crows. The burial is simple because life here is complicated enough. A cross, a shallow stone, a name said aloud by the few who remember it without consulting a roll. Occasionally the master speaks, and his voice makes the ground seem more willing to hold what you hand it. There is no weeping officially. Unofficially, the eyes have their own rule, and it supersedes yours when no one reputable is looking. Once, in a more theatrical army, you were offered a minstrel. The order solved that problem the way it solves all problems, by forbidding the premise. There is no music except chant, and chant is music that has been told to behave. Still, you hear other rhythms: hammer on anvil, hoof on packed earth, spoon in pot, wind worrying the tent ropes, the muttered profanity of a farrier who refuses to teach you his better words. These are your ballads. They stick. On campaign, the camp is a city in denial. Streets appear out of stubbornness, kitchens sprout where the smoke finds agreement with the sky, latrines move, or do not, with a logic that would make a saint reconsider charity. You are told where to pitch your tent. You pitch it anyway, where the ground looks like it has forgiven rain before. The cook swears he could make anything into soup. You test this hypothesis and regret participating in science. Fires are watched like children or thieves, depending on who started them. The master's tent is a smaller church without sacraments. Men enter shorter and leave carrying more orders than bones. Your kit, laid out, looks like a confession. Mail, helm, chausses, gambeson, surcoat, sword, dagger, belt, pouches, flint, needle, spoon, cup, skin, rosary. The absence is as important as the presence. Dice, forbidden, jewels, wasted, vanity, disciplined, privacy, imaginary. You keep your notched memories on the inside of your scabbard throat with your thumb. They wear smoother than your conscience. You can pack in the dark and unpack in the rain and strap a hauberk on a moving horse because necessity is the mother of tricks and, here's the thing, fathers them too. Politics raids the camp more efficiently than any light cavalry. Papal legates arrive with banners as heavy as their Latin. Kings arrive with appetites as heavy as their banners. Counts arrive with grievances knitted into their sleeves. You stand at attention while they decide whether your body is worth the plan they devised over a goose. The master bows with the finesse of a man who has practiced not meaning it. You learn to keep your face still even when your stomach has opinions, because the order is a wall and walls do not make faces unless they are cracking. Merit is noticed, but narrative is fed. If you die well, someone will say so in a line that sounds like it was written before you were born. If you live unglamorously, no one will say anything at all, which is the order's preferred method of praise. You will not get a statue, you will get a chore. You will not get a song, you will get seconds of lentils. You will not get a reward, you will get another sunrise and the chance to confess again that yesterday you were proud, angry, hungry, and insufficiently resigned to providence. The rule will forgive you because the rule is busy and forgiveness is efficient. Contact with locals is both unavoidable and regulated like a contagious joy. The rule says avoid women. The market says avoid prices without haggling. You learn to bargain with your eyes and step aside with your entire body. The baker who sells you flatbread wraps it in a look that says she knows you are hungry for more than flour. You accept the bread and decline the seraphic complication. A scholar selling manuscripts tries to convince you that geometry is from God and should be priced accordingly. You agree and still offer less. A child offers water from a jar that smells like goat. You drink, say, God repay you, and mean it without knowing exactly what accounting method you are suggesting. Heat teaches you different prayers than cold. In winter, you ask for endurance. In summer, you ask not to be a candle. The mail becomes a sauna. The helm becomes a sermon. The sun becomes an uninvited supervisor. Shade is strategy, wind is doctrine, clouds are diplomacy. You learn to walk different, smaller steps, watered breath, mouth closed to the dust that has read more scripture than you. The men from here make it look easy. You hate them for it and hire them anyway. Reading in the order is a communal sport disguised as penance. At meals, the brother reader stands and inflicts piety on your appetite. The rule, scripture, statutes, sometimes a homily about humility artfully delivered by a man who has never had to be humble in front of a horse. There is also, blessedly, the notice of faults, a gentle public exercise in mutual improvement, where a brother stands and says, I accuse myself of sleeping at Lord's, and everyone nods as if he has donated a relic. You prefer mortar mixing to this. Mortar never expects applause. Promotion is a rumour followed by a chore. If you are made a sergeant, your pay is discipline. If you're made a knight brother with responsibilities over others, your reward is their mistakes. You acquire a key, which opens precisely what you do not need and makes you responsible for exactly what you cannot influence. The master gives you a look that says, this will make sense when you are older, which you suspect is a euphemism for, this never makes sense. You take the key anyway, because obedience turns nonsense into work. A day comes that pretends to be different. The trumpets sound like they mean it. Word runs down the line that tomorrow dawn means movement. Banners up, columns out, the whole machine creaking into purpose. The camp inhales. The cook counts heads and curses arithmetic. The quartermaster squints at lists that were wrong before he wrote them. The chaplain polishes his sermons. You lay out your kit, check every strap, kiss your rosary, not because you are pious, though perhaps you are by now, accidentally, but because ritual is how hands soothe the mind. Sleep on the eve of marching is an impostor. Every sound is a messenger. The clink of mail, the fart of a nervous recruit, the long contented chew of a horse that doesn't care about your mortality. You doze and rise and doze and rise and finally surrender to wakefulness the way a city surrenders to a siege. Not with fireworks, with paperwork. Dawn is not a colour, but a schedule. The bell rings. You stand. Prayers stack like shields. The world becomes simple in the way only horrible things do. Breakfast is fast. Bread dipped in something that remembered being soup. A handful of olives that break monotony, if not hunger. You drink deliberately and put the skin away unfinished, because the first lesson of the march is that the second lesson of the march is thirst. The line forms itself like a long, uncertain sentence that hopes its verb will arrive in time. Banners tilt, men cough, horses negotiate. The master rides past and says nothing, because there is nothing left to say that isn't already in your bones. The march begins. Step, step, discipline, step, step, prayer, step, step, curse swallowed as a courtesy to your soul. The road is a thesis on misery, written by a teacher who hates feet. Dust climbs into your helmet and stays there. Squires run like punctuation from clause to clause, carrying missing straps and found courage. A mule with more character than sense decides to stop being a mule and instead becomes a wall. 4 men argue theology at it until a woman from a nearby village fixes the issue with a word that you suspect is not in Latin. You pass olive groves where the trees look older than God's patience, fields where men stoop with a rhythm that does not recognize banners, wells where boys stare with the curiosity of a world that cannot afford curiosity. A dog follows for half a mile and then, in a move that has broken better hearts than yours, decides you are boring. You adopt the rejection as penance and continue. Midday is announced not by a clock, but by the collective decision to stop pretending that stopping is not inevitable. You form a rough square, collapse into shade that the quartermaster insists on calling tactical, and eat the edible fraction of what you carry. Lentils again, which feels like a moral failing on your part. A brother offers you a dried fig. You consider it a sacrament. A leather bottle goes around. It contains water that has briefly shaken hands with wine. Everyone pretends the handshake lingered. The master confers with men who can afford to look unpersuadable. Scouts return with descriptions of hills that sound like advice. Someone mentions a river, someone else mentions a crossing. A third someone mentions a memory of a different river that taught him the meaning of the word miscalculation. Orders ripple down the line, changing shape as they go, the way a rumor becomes a prophecy if enough frightened men repeat it with conviction. Afternoon is for bargaining with heat and distance. The wedge forms and reforms. You curse softly at a strap that will not agree with your skin. You think treasonously about wells. You think more treasonously about bread with butter. You think most treasonously of all about the small garden outside your father's house and the way mint will grow in any soil as long as it can insult other plants. You file these thoughts under temptations and return your mind to the catechism of marching. Head up, line steady, breath like counting. A skirmish arrives the way a sneeze does, too late to stop, too sudden to dignify. Arrows first, because the enemy is not stupid, then shapes on the ridge, then horse and shouts, then the tipping point where thinking hands off to training. Your lance levels, your knees tell your horse a sentence he's heard, the wedge becomes a verb. The world narrows to the 5 men who might kill you and the one you can reach. Time becomes unhelpful. The first impact is theology delivered by mass. The second is grammar delivered by steel. Someone to your left falls and keeps riding badly. Someone to your right shouts a name that is not yours and then makes it your problem. It ends because skirmishes end. One side decides it has made its point. The enemy withdraws like a well-rehearsed act. Dust softens the edges of their retreat. A boy on a hill learns a word he will pretend not to know tonight when his mother asks why he is quiet. You breathe like a man learning how again. You count brothers. You note absences. You say nothing because there is currently nothing to say that would not multiply sorrow. The chaplain appears, sweating doctrine. He begins a prayer that is shorter than his usual, which is the best thing you can say about him today. Dusk is mercy tinted red. The camp blooms again in the skeleton of order your bodies carry with them. Tents up, lines drawn, fires negotiated. Bread reappears, wine pretends to, water demands attention. The farrier becomes a god again. Someone laughs the wrong laugh and receives a look that says, "Tonight is not the night for hope that sounds like despair." You eat, you clean, you pray, you check straps, You look at the stars and think how nice it is that they are not your problem, at least officially. The brother reader chooses a chapter on humility and reads it with the particular zeal of a man who is not currently humble. Night watch is the loneliest sacrament. You stand with a spear that has dreams of being useful, eyes trained to divide darkness into categories: friend, foe, animal, wind, mistake. The camp breathes. Horses shift. Somewhere far off, a dog comments on theology. You recite psalms to keep your mouth from inventing panic. You rehearse the day's sins and resolve to commit fewer tomorrow with the confident optimism of a man who hasn't met tomorrow yet. When your relief arrives, you feel more grateful than you will admit to anyone, including God. Sleep again, and the bed is exactly as narrow as yesterday, and the mantle is exactly as scratchy, and your sword is exactly as close. The dream returns. You are in the refectory at home, and the bread is fresh, and the wine has forgotten its manners, and the master is late, and the bell is broken. And you wake smiling, and immediately forgive the bell for not being broken. Days fold. The calendar obeys saints and supply ships. You learn the names of winds and the habits of merchants and the difference between zeal and competence. You can now tell, by the way a commander pinches the bridge of his nose, whether tomorrow will require courage or patience, and you suspect, most days, it will require both. If you are lucky, the season ends with more men than it began. If you are honest, the season ends with different men than it began. You collect small victories, a bridge held, a caravan returned, a village that still has a millstone where you left it. You collect small losses, a brother whose laugh you can't remember correctly anymore, a scar on your horse's rib that tells a story neither of you wishes to repeat. You send the story home on a ship that may or may not arrive. You keep the scar. And always, through it all, there is the rule: tedious, necessary, infuriating, merciful. It keeps your hands busy when your mind would like to rebel. It keeps your mouth shut when your pride would like to audition for sainthood. It keeps your body pointed in the same direction as your brother's, long enough for an army to be something other than a rumour. The rule is your diet when the cook is imaginative, and your shelter when the sky is not. You obey not because obedience is noble, though men with seals love that argument, but because obedience is fast, and speed saves lives that courage cannot. You once thought knighthood was glory attached to a horse. It turns out to be discipline attached to a schedule, humility welded to metal, hunger negotiated with a prayer. You once thought the Holy Land would smell like incense and legend. It smells like sweat, vinegar, horses, dust, cumin, and the inside of your helm. You once thought God lived in the sepulchre and visited the field. Now you suspect he visits the kitchens more often, and the latrines, and the farrier's corner where 4 nails decide whether 10 lives arrive where they intend. Tomorrow will be the same, if you're blessed or exciting, if you're not. Either way, the bell will ring, and you'll rise, and the bread will crunch, and the horses will judge you, and the master will walk like a sermon you have already memorized. You'll oil the hinge that squeaked, check the strap that lied, forgive the brother who snores, drill the cut you botched, and say the prayer you can now recite while asleep. You will keep moving along the narrow path between austerity and absurdity, because the order insists, and because you have learned, with some surprise, that the path is wide enough for a man to fit if he leaves most of himself behind. And on the rare night when the wind finds a way through the tents that doesn't insult your skin, when the stars burn the sky into a map that refuses to be read, when the camp is silent in that heavy, decent way that means no one is dying loudly right now, you will permit yourself a thought that is almost vanity and almost gratitude, that you are good at this, at eating without lust, at praying without theatre, at fighting without poetry, at living with a discipline so stubborn it sometimes feels like peace. Then you will remind yourself the rule forbids thinking too well of yourself, and you will compromise by thinking well of your horse instead. The bell will ring again, it always does, and you will rise because you always do. You learn very quickly that a crusade is less a holy journey, and more a very long, very disorganized walk in the wrong kind of weather, and the stories the priests told back home about righteous conquest and God's guiding hand begin to look suspiciously like sales pitches once your boots fill with water for the third day in a row, and you find yourself chewing on a piece of bread so hard it could be used as a weapon. The road ahead is a shifting procession of men who smell like they've been buried and dug back up, banners that hang limp in the humid air, and the constant clank of armor, reminding you that the same steel meant to protect you will also rub your shoulders raw long before an enemy arrow gets the chance to find you. You share space with men who only yesterday were farmers, bakers, blacksmiths, and who now pretend to be soldiers because a bishop said it would please God, though their only real military experience is chasing a runaway pig. And you start to suspect that the true miracle will not be the liberation of the Holy Land, but the fact that any of you arrive there alive at all. Your meals are whatever can be found, bought, or stolen, and on some days that means salted fish hard enough to chip a tooth. On others, it's a stew so thin it could be classified as a rumour. And on the rare blessed afternoon when a goat is slaughtered, you eat until your gut protests, because you know tomorrow will be lean again. The days blur, blistered feet, aching back, sun hammering down on your helmet until you feel your thoughts melting, followed by nights of cold so sharp it slices through your woolen cloak like a knife through confession paper. And the only constants are the prayers you mumble more from habit than faith, and the grinding realization that the enemy you were promised is still far away. Yet already you've begun to lose men to disease, desertion, and the occasional accidental stabbing after an argument over water. You see brothers in arms turn into scavengers, stripping the boots from the dead because leather is rarer than mercy here. When you finally see the walls of an enemy city, they rise in the distance like the edge of the world itself, and for a moment you almost understand the sermons about glory, until the first arrow whistles past and reminds you that glory is something usually admired by the living from a safe distance. The siege begins not with a roar, but with 1,000 small inconveniences. Camp latrines overflowing, bread supplies running out, tempers fraying like old rope, and the enemy taunting you from behind stone so thick you begin to think God himself would need a siege tower to get in. You haul stones, build rams, watch as men far braver or far dumber than you attempt to scale ladders slick with their own blood, and you learn quickly that this is not the chess game the commanders imagine, but something closer to a tavern brawl that refuses to end. You chew on boiled leather when food runs out, drink water from barrels that taste of mould, and sleep in shifts because the enemy prefers to launch arrows at night when your eyes are heavy and your guard is lower than your faith. When the city finally falls, whether by force, by famine, or by the quiet betrayal of someone inside, the air fills with smoke, screams, and the particular smell of men who will claim they acted in God's name while wiping their swords on their own tunics. You take your share because everyone else does, though you tell yourself it's not greed but survival, and you notice that the same knights who scolded squires for sloth back home now carry so much loot they walk with a stoop. And when the blood has dried and the banners have been raised, you look around and realize that for all the speeches about God and justice, the real victors here are the merchants who will sell the spoils back in Europe and the scribes who will turn this messy, hungry, ugly thing into a tale worth telling. Though you know better because you were here and you can still taste the dust in your teeth. You return to Europe not with a parade, but with a limp and a saddle that now knows the shape of your doubts. And the first lesson in peacetime is that it is not peace at all, merely a different kind of campaign where the enemies wear rings instead of helmets. And the battlefields are parchment, hearths, counting tables, and chapels, where the bell schedules you again the way the drum did, and you discover with a dull, unsurprised ache that discipline weighs the same whether it is forged from steel or from rulebooks. The preceptory welcomes you the way a mill welcomes grain, without sentiment, with purpose, and you are immediately reabsorbed into the machine that calls itself holy poverty and looks suspiciously like careful accounting, where your mantle is bleached, your beard trimmed, your horse assigned a stall that smells of hay and humility, and your name entered into a ledger that will remember you better than any ballad ever would. Breakfast in this calmer war remembers how to be food again, which is to say, it stops pretending to be punishment and becomes fuel. Trenches of bread baked in a real oven that does not travel, a pottage thick enough to argue with your spoon, cheese that squeaks when you bite it because the cows here graze on actual grass instead of on miracles, and, on days when the calendar forgives meat, a slab of salt pork that confesses its sins loudly in the pan. On fast days you do penance with fish and with self-control, and the brother reader reminds you between mouthfuls that St. Benedict had opinions, capital O, which the order has adopted and then sharpened, so you chew quietly and you learn again the old choreography of silence, eyes that speak, hands that apologize, a cough that translates as "pass the salt" without incriminating anyone's soul. The work of a Templar at home, or as close to home as men like you are allowed to come, is not the lethargy you feared. It is logistics with a halo on, the daily precise miracle of turning rents and harvests into armor and oats and letters of credit that cross borders faster than any army, and your days begin to fill with tasks you once thought belonged to other species of men, riding to outlying farms to count sheep with a seriousness you once reserved for enemy scouts, standing in cold barns negotiating wool tithes with shepherds whose faces can withhold an entire winter, measuring grain in granaries that echo like churches, hearing petitions in a hall where the complainants are millers and widows rather than barons, and learning that justice, when draped in a white mantle, still smells like wet wool and ink. There are afternoons when you supervise the forge because a preceptory without iron is a vow of folly rather than poverty, and the smith looks at you with the strange respect men reserve for those who survived elsewhere. So you trade him tails for nails. His are short and hot, yours are long and cooling, and the bargain makes both of you human. On other days, you walk the vineyard rows with a brother who claims vines confess to him if you ask in the right French, his hands explaining trellis and graft and rot as if these were parts of a sermon, and you discover that pruning is the closest peacetime comes to tactics, a decision about what must be cut now so something better can live later, and you accept the parable gratefully because your head still hosts too many other, uglier sermons. Training does not stop because the borders are far. The yard behind the chapel rings with wooden blades and the wordless arguments of men correcting each other's posture, and though your shoulder complains, you drill anyway, because skill is the one inheritance you trust not to be taxed. The young ones move like they are trying to impress saints. The old ones move like they know saints are already sufficiently impressed, and you spend more time than you will admit, teaching wrists how to be honest and knees how to speak to horses. The fine grammar of survival you never had time to learn in a school, because your schools smelled of dust and cumin and screamed. Letters arrive like sparrows and sometimes like hawks. Some come from ports with names that make your tongue remember the market songs. They carry news in cramped hands about convoys that need escort, about ransoms that require discretion, about castles that wish to be friendlier to you than to their neighbours. Others come tied with the wax of nobles who discovered that the order's virtue includes excellent safes, and they speak of deposits, of drafts, of something new and potent that moves money without moving coin. And you are dispatched to ride quietly to a fair and receive a pouch that is lighter than its worth. A folded promise will turn into wages and tack and flour 3 countries away, and you marvel, privately, that parchment and trust together can be sharper than cavalry. When not counting, drilling, receiving, or riding, you are hosting, because hospitality is another kind of armory. Pilgrims eat at the long tables beneath the preceptory's rafters and inform you at immodest volume that Jerusalem is farther than it looks on a map and that sin tastes different in each town. And you nod, refill bowls, and embargo your advice because experience, unlike salt, cannot be forced into a man without making him choke. Merchants come too and pretend their ledgers are novenas, and you practice the order's neutral smile that says both We are not corruptible, and we understand discounts, a theology that offends everyone equally and therefore must be correct. You discover courts, those polite tournaments where words replace lances and wounds take the forms of fines and precedent. The order's bailiff places you on a bench and points you at disputes that would make a seraph swear, fences accused of moving in the night, streams charged with stealing from fields, a cow that allegedly tried bigamy, and you listen, question, weigh, and finally pronounce. In a tone that hopes to convince the losing side, this was providence rather than arithmetic. Later, alone, you cut bread and chew in the quiet kitchen and tell yourself it was arithmetic, because arithmetic can be repented when it is wrong. Habit drapes itself across your hours the way your cloak drapes your shoulders, and you start to know the year again by smell rather than by threat. Spring with its honest mud and dishonest promises, summer when flies attend vespers uninvited, harvest when the preceptory hums like a hive, and you remember at last what abundance looks like. Winter when the chapel air turns into glass and your breath argues with the candles. Each season has its foods, and your memory receives them like old comrades. Fresh bread first out of the oven that scalds your impatience and redeems it. A stew so thick the spoon considers surrender. Apples wrinkling themselves into sugar on a shelf. Eels glistening with penance on Fridays. Ale that minds its manners and wine that does not. And on feast days, a roasted beast large enough to make humility editorialize. You eat more slowly now, not out of etiquette, which the rule provides, but out of gratitude, which you are learning to improvise. The nights are different here. Sleep arrives mostly on time and does not often bring knives, but some evenings it forgets its obligations, and you rise without waking anyone and step into the yard where the stars are not the stars you used to watch, because place rewrites the sky as surely as doctrine rewrites habit. The chill reminds you that you are both living and forgiven, and the horse in the corner stall lifts his head to tell you in equine that he approves of oats as a philosophy, and you scratch his blaze and agree that almost every problem improves when fed. Confession becomes less theatrical and more thorough. You tell the chaplain you are proud, hungry, impatient, that you sometimes loathe the sound of the bell because it interrupts a thought that might have turned into a prayer, that sometimes at dinner you forget to hate sin and hate instead whoever salted the pottage, that the rule feels like a mother and other days like a courtroom. He shrugs, absolves, prescribes psalms that you already know by heart, and then, because he is an honest man and therefore curious, asks you about the desert, and you say, "It is large," which is a small cowardice and also accurate. And both of you accept the answer because it is late and the bread in the kitchen is cooling toward charity. There are recruits. They arrive with eyes that have not yet learned tact and with family letters that smell like kitchen smoke. You show them how to saddle a horse without getting judged, how to eat fast without losing dignity, how to answer a noble's question with enough humility to survive and enough steel to avoid being lent like a pot. You teach them how to write their names even if the order will later ask them to forget the writing and keep only the obedience, because a man who can sign can also read, and a man who can read can sometimes be reasoned with before dawn. Now and then, the past trips you in broad daylight. A cart hits a stone and the sound is a door slamming in a siege. A child drops a wooden spoon and the clatter is a lance glancing off mail. The kitchen stirs cumin into a pot because some pilgrim from the south paid in spice instead of coin, and for an hour every corridor in the preceptory smells like a market near a gate where you once bought a date's worth of forgiveness. You finish your chores, you breathe through your irritation at living, and later you apologize to God for cursing the cook's generosity, and your apology, like the cumin, lingers longer than you intended. Not all work stays within your walls. The master sends you with 3 brothers and a pack train to an abbey whose cellar has become a rumour. Rumour, you discover, is heavier than wineskins, and at each bridge a different lord suggests that piety is taxed per hoof. You smile and show him a seal. You quote a privilege, You mention a cousin of a cousin who forgot how to be patient with men who forget the order's exemptions, and you proceed, learning that diplomacy is simply courage that has learned to speak quietly. On the road you share bread with carters, scripture with an old woman who insists on lecturing you about greed, news with a jongleur who insists on lecturing you about love, and silence with your horse, who lectures you about nothing at all and is therefore the better theologian. The preceptory's vault is a church that does not pretend otherwise. It holds ransoms that will become men again, dowries that will become alliances, arms that will become roofs, and the offering a widow makes with hands that shake from the 2 days' walk it took to bring a bag of coins to the only institution she trusts not to flirt with them. You stand guard there sometimes, and the room teaches you a new fear, not of theft, which you know how to meet, but of stewardship, which is heavier and does not shout when you fail it. You find yourself murmuring inventory like a psalm and mean it. Feasts return to the calendar in a manner that startles your stomach more than your soul, and on the eve of Saint, whoever you discover, again the messy charity of plenty, a long table, a cut of beef immodest in its candour, loaves as numerous as arguments in a chapter meeting, a pie inside's attempt to escape, a jug of ale that doesn't understand modesty, and a jug of wine that understands nothing whatsoever, and you watch men who bled in silence rediscover laughter with the skill of men who intend to forget it again by midnight. The rule frowns politely, and you, who have made peace with paradoxes sharper than this, allow yourself the ecstasy of second helpings. Sometimes you ride out to settle quarrels for lords who would rather borrow the order's neutrality than become acquainted with their own. You sit beneath a beam blackened by many winters and listen to two men explain why the same strip of meadow belongs entirely to each of them, and you convince them both that compromise is not cowardice, but the only way to make time move forward. They agree because your mantle is a miracle that makes reason fashionable, and afterwards the lady of the house presses upon you a plate of pastries that have memorized butter, and you test your vows against them, and discover that God, being practical, has constructed the universe so that penitence can follow promptly after indulgence. The years acquire a gait. You can tell by a horse's breath how much frost the morning plans to supply. You can tell by the master's posture how much patience the chapter will require. You can tell by the baker's loaf whether the miller and the river are married this week. You can tell by the abbot's opening mouth whether he wants money or men. And you prepare like a carpenter laying out tools. The little speeches that make a no sound like a blessing and a yes sound like strategy, and you find, to your astonishment, that truth leans nearer to both than you had suspected when you were younger and busy being sharp. Not all doors open toward you. A sheriff with a memory like an ulcer decides the order is too rich to be righteous and invites you to share his opinion in public. A banker without a church decides your ledgers are witchcraft, written in numbers. A poet decides chastity is unpoetic and explains this to your face with a smile that hopes you will contradict him with a sword. You answer the sheriff with parchment, the banker with arithmetic, the poet with a blessing too polite to be mistaken for affection, and you walk away intact, which counts as victory in a century that rarely gives you better. There are nights when the young brothers ask you for tales and you indulge them with the harmless parts. The colour of a market at noon, the ridiculous bravery of a mule, the taste of sour water when you were so thirsty it made poetry, the time a farrier saved 20 lives with 4 nails and a shout. You do not offer them the other parts, the parts that breed only nightmares or romances, because you have learned that both are lies with good manners and you owe them something more usefully ugly. How to pack in the dark without forgetting the flint, how to keep bread from turning into discouragement, how to speak to nobles without becoming furniture, how to lose and then keep moving, how to win and then keep quiet. Illness finds you, as it finds all men who have made the mistake of being mortal. It begins in the ankle you wrenched in a ditch and wrote a ballad about in your knee, proceeds to your shoulder where old impacts have built a nest, and then, deciding to get serious, discovers your lungs. The infirmary prescribes rest with a piety that knows it will be ignored. prescribes herbs that taste like sermons, prescribes heat that makes your bones confess things you had not planned to say aloud. You obey in fragments and discover that obedience in fragments still counts, and the fever passes like a visiting dignitary, leaving debts and gratitude and a room that smells decisively of vinegar. When word comes of new campaigns, your hands remember their old fidgets, the checking of straps that are not on you, the counting of rations you will not carry, the quiet sorting of prayers into those for departure and those for return. And you go to the chapel and ask for the audacity to remain useful here, where usefulness looks like inventory and peace looks like boredom. The bell answers with its usual lack of nuance, which is comfort if you tilt your head and you accept again the narrower, steadier glory of making sure the men who go out will not run out of bread before they run out of courage. On a morning shaped like any other, you are sent to a town where the order's house keeps a guest room for people who cannot afford enemies, and you end up at a table with a widow who has walked 8 miles to deposit the price of her husband's life in your care. She is not crying, which does not mean she is not breaking. You sign a receipt, promise a prayer, promise interest the way the order does, in kindness measured by habit. And when she leaves, you discover your bread has become unpalatable, so you donate it to a dog who is shockingly orthodox about gratitude. Later, at Compline, you offer God a complaint equal parts proud and ashamed, and God answers you with the silence he reserves for men who are finally learning to use it. Evenings can be generous. The kitchen remembers to sweeten porridge with honey because a beekeeper tithed with liquid sunlight. The cellars agree to a more convivial wine because the last batch sulked. A novice breaks rule and makes a joke in the cloister that is actually funny, and you do not report him because mercy is contagious when plausible. The master tells a story so old it feels new again, about a knight who thought humility was a garment and not a verb, and when the laughter calms he looks at you as if to say, yes, that knight was me. And you are grateful that authority occasionally entertains its own history. Winter pushes everyone indoors, and the preceptory becomes a hive whose hum includes mending, reading, sharpening, and the particular bark of a log that explodes with a flair for drama. You inventory the armory, again, because repetition is the religion that works. And while your hands count spearheads, your mind composes a prayer that is mostly a shopping list. You repair harness, alternating between leather needles and recollections you would rather not sew into anything, and when a brother asks if you will spar, you decline with a shrug that says your shoulder has resigned, not your courage. Spring arrives, and you remember that the world was always a green conspiracy against despair. Lambs violate composure in every meadow. The mill complains about nothing, and therefore about everything. Pilgrims sprout along the roads like opinions. You take young brothers to a field and show them how to fall in mud without becoming men who live there. You apologize to a ploughman for the hoof marks your errand left in his furrows, and he accepts with the benevolence of a king, which he is in April. You return to the preceptory and tell the cook that leeks are proof of providence, and he tells you that men who praise vegetables should chop them, and you obey gratefully. There are anniversaries you pretend not to mark. A date when a city burned, convenient and inconvenient at once. A name day of a brother you buried where the wind is still telling the story to anyone with ears. The length of time since you last heard the desert sing at dusk like a choir with dust in its throat. On those days, you volunteer for extra stable duty because horses do not ask why your hands are shaking, and the farrier loans you a rasp that makes an honest sound, and the forge remembers how to be a heart for a building that is otherwise made of stone and vow. Toward the end of the year, a noble arrives to ask if the order will stoop to accept a donation of land he no longer feels like paying taxes on, and the master stoops magnificently, and you ride out to walk its boundaries, which are salt-bitten and sceptical, and you conclude that holiness will be hard to grow here. Nevertheless, you arrange for fences and a tenant who knows how to argue with wind, and you come back with a map that looks like a cross stitched by a child and a plan that looks like stubbornness stitched by God, and the chapter votes yes, because stubbornness is a sacrament when administered by competent men. One evening, after a day that was ordinary with a precision that made it nearly sacred, you sit on the low wall by the herb garden and understand, without fanfare, that you did return from the crusade, not the way songs allege, but the way bread returns from grain, ground, mixed, heated, changed, and that the order, for all its contradictions and aromas, for all its rules that save you and its rules that itch, has made a place where your hands still speak a language the world needs. Counting, calming, mending, training, escorting, deciding, praying, and, on good days, laughing. You also understand that if the bell rang now for a march, you could go. That the body is a mule that forgets grudges if fed correctly, but you also understand that the bell will likely call you tomorrow to the granary instead, and the thought does not sour your mouth, which is how you measure miracle without bothering God with paperwork. And so the after-campaign life you dreaded becomes a road with milestones and inns and arguments and reliable bread, and you discover with a humility that doesn't need to be acted that faith is not a banner held high in sun that makes eyes praise you, but a set of calluses arranged where the world keeps trying to rub you down to nothing and failing. When the young brothers ask you, at last, what was it like there? You tell them about a day when a mule and a boy saved 20 men by insisting on water, about a night when the stars wrote a letter you couldn't read but obeyed, about a morning when your enemy's horse recognized your horse as a cousin and both animals refused to cooperate until the men found their manners, and you leave out the other parts, not because you are kind, which would be a novelty, but because some truths, like certain meats, do more good when cooked down slowly into stock that nourishes everyone without showing bones. By the time winter returns again, your shoulder has negotiated a truce with the weather. Your stomach no longer mistakes peace for absence. Your prayers have learned to start with gratitude and only later indulge in requests. Your sword is oiled and honest. Even though it spends most days joking with dust, your horse considers you adequate, which is the highest equine compliment, and your name in the ledger has acquired another neat line in a hand steadier than yours. The bell rings, you get up, and the day begins, and you realize, not with a shiver but with a nod, that this, too, is a crusade. Without banners, without trumpets, without the theatre of distance. Fought inch by inch against waste, hunger, fear, loneliness, and the dangerous romance of memory. A campaign that will never be sung properly because it involves too much counting and not enough dying, which suits you fine because you have finally learned to prefer bread to ballads. You had thought the noise in your head would quiet down eventually, that after the dust of the last campaign settled, after the horses stopped screaming in your dreams, after the stench of 1,000 unwashed men faded from your cloak, there would be a kind of stillness. Not peace exactly, you've long since stopped believing in that, but a dull, tolerable hum, the sort you could live alongside without much complaint. For a while, you even managed it. Days fell into each other like obedient servants. You woke when the sun crawled over the stone walls. You ate bread gone hard enough to crack teeth without caring. You returned from the Holy Land, not to the trumpet fanfares of illuminated manuscripts, or the solemn nods of bishops pretending they didn't doubt you'd make it back, but to the awkward, fumbling silence of a village that doesn't quite know how to greet a man who's seen too much and smells faintly of old leather, dried blood, and the kind of sweat you only produce under foreign suns. The ship had docked on a grey morning, the sky hanging low like a reprimand, and the first breath of home air hit you with a scent of damp earth and wood smoke that almost made you believe in peace. Almost. But peace, as you quickly learn, is not an absence of war. It's a smaller battlefield, in a tighter space, with fewer banners and more petty grievances. They gave you a room above a tanner's workshop, because the monastery didn't have the budget to host returning crusaders who weren't on official business anymore. The bed is straw, the walls are cold stone, and there's a draft that whistles like an old confessor disappointed in your moral choices. You tell yourself it's fine, you've slept under worse. Open desert skies that turn to ice at night, the stench of bodies buried too shallow. the damp heat of tents where wounded men moan themselves into eternity. Here, at least, there are no scorpions in your boots. Here, at least, the sounds at night are just rats, not Saracen scouts slipping past the campfires. The village doesn't ask about the war. Not really. Oh, there are questions, of course, but they're the sort people ask when they want stories, not truths. Did you kill many? Was it glorious? Were the cities beautiful? You answer with half smiles and half lies, because the truth involves the colour of a man's eyes when he realises the spear is already inside him, and the way victory smells like spoiled meat left in the sun. The truth doesn't go well with bread and ale. You develop a routine, mornings spent in the chapel, though not always praying, sometimes just staring at the crucifix and wondering if he too has moments where the nails feel real again. Afternoons you wander the fields, the rhythm of sowing and reaping so absurdly calm it almost makes you laugh, until you remember the men you saw cut down mid-step, their harvests half-finished forever. In the evenings you eat stew that tastes of turnips and resignation, and listen to the chatter of people who believe their greatest danger is a bad winter. You should envy them. You don't. Sometimes, though, in the quiet, you catch yourself thinking you might stay here. Not out of joy, but out of exhaustion. You've done your share, you've bled enough. Let some other fool carry the cross and the sword into lands where the soil is soaked in both faith and treachery. Let the young ones discover that a holy cause doesn't make a blade cut any cleaner. Let them find out for themselves that God's work often looks suspiciously like man's greed when you tilt it toward the light. And then it happens. You're sitting in the tanner's shop, pretending to help sort hides while mostly trying not to think about how much the smell reminds you of battlefield camps when you hear the hoofbeats. Not the lazy, ambling kind, but the urgent, pounding rhythm of someone carrying news they think will matter. The door swings open, and in steps a messenger with a tabard dusted in the road's long miles and a face flushed from cold air. He holds a parchment sealed with the kind of wax that makes men stand straighter and women lower their eyes. You know that seal before you even see it. You've worn it on your surcoat. You've killed under it. The abbot reads it aloud in the square later that day, his voice carrying that holy tremor meant to inspire rather than inform. Another crusade. Another call from Rome, gilded in the language of salvation, but weighted with the undertones of land, power, and the kind of coin only war seems to shake loose. The crowd murmurs like sheep, deciding whether the shadow on the horizon is a cloud or a wolf. The young ones grin, puffing their chests, imagining themselves bathed in glory. The old ones frown, because they have seen how easily glory washes off in the mud. You stand there, motionless, while the words slide into your skull like an old dagger finding a familiar wound. You tell yourself, you're not going. Absolutely not. You've done your penance in blood. You've proved your loyalty in the currency they value most, other men's lives. And yet. That night, you lie in your straw bed, staring at the rafters as the draft sighs over your feet and the memories start lining up like soldiers in formation. The march at dawn, armour biting your shoulders, the clang of swords echoing between stone walls, the strange beauty of Jerusalem's streets in the morning light, the camaraderie of men who know they might not see sundown but share their last crust of bread anyway. War was hell, yes, but it was also purpose. And here, now, in this small, damp village, you are a sword without a sheath, a warhorse left to pull a cart. You tell yourself that's a good thing. You tell yourself it's better to be forgotten than remembered only as a name on a weathered grave marker. But in the silence, you realize the truth. You miss it. Not the killing exactly, though you've made your peace with that sin. You miss the clarity. In war, you always knew who the enemy was, where he stood, what he wanted. Here, the enemies are smaller and slipperier. Jealous neighbours, petty guild politics, winter hunger. You can't swing a sword at those. Over the next days, the rumours grow like mould. Knights are gathering in Marseille. Ships are being outfitted. The Pope himself has blessed the campaign. They say this one will be different, faster, more decisive. They always say that. Men you trained with have already signed on. You avoid them in the market, but you hear their voices behind you, loud with excitement, trying not to notice that they're also loud with fear. Then one afternoon, as you're walking back from the fields, you see them, 2 Templar brothers in full habit, white mantles bright against the muddy street. They're speaking with the abbot, but you catch their glances toward you. It's not subtle. They approach. They greet you not as a man, but as a resource. Polished steel left too long on a shelf. There's talk of honor, of duty, of God's will. They remind you of the oaths you swore, and though you want to argue that you've already fulfilled them, the words dry up in your mouth. That night, you drink more than usual. The tanner doesn't mind. He's seen this look before. You try to picture yourself boarding another ship, feeling the seas roll beneath your boots, smelling the salt and the pitch and the anticipation. You try to picture yourself refusing, staying here, watching the others march off without you. Neither vision sits comfortably. Sleep comes late, and when it does, it drags you back to Acre. The sun is blinding, the stones too hot to touch, the air thick with cries and the iron taste of blood. You wake before dawn, heart racing, and for a moment you can't tell if it's fear or longing. By the week's end, you hear your name in the square. The abbot is listing those who will join the new crusade, and somehow yours has made it onto the parchment. You don't remember saying yes. Maybe you didn't. Maybe the choice was made for you long ago, when you first took the vow, when you first lifted the sword in God's name and learned how heavy both could be. You walk home slowly, the weight of inevitability settling on your shoulders like armor you'd forgotten how to wear. In the street, children play at knights and Saracens, their wooden swords clacking in the chill air. You almost tell them to stop, to play something else, but the words stick. You were them once, and now, once again, you will be what they pretend to be. And for the first time since you returned, you feel something like certainty, bitter, unwelcome, but solid as steel. You are going back. You try, of course. No man with sense runs headfirst into a second crusade without at least pretending to hesitate. So you begin your campaign of small evasions, slow answers to summons, vague nods in the market when the abbot's assistant corners you, convenient absences when the recruiters ride through the village again. You take on extra work in the fields, hoping that the appearance of usefulness will make them reluctant to drag you away. You even go so far as to limp slightly when you pass the church, just enough to suggest that perhaps your best days of swinging a sword are behind you. But the thing about oaths is that they're like brands, burned deep into the flesh, visible even after the skin has healed. People remember. And once the Templars have decided you belong to them again, all your little tricks and stalling are as useful as a wooden shield in a fire. You hear the hoofbeats again on a cold morning, this time paired with the creak of wagon wheels. Supplies, you guess, though you pointedly keep your eyes on the stack of hides you're hauling from the tanner's shop. But the sound stops right outside, and before you can think of a polite escape, the doorway fills with 2 men you've met before. One with the lined, weather-bitten face of a man who's slept more nights under canvas than under a roof. The other with the calm, polished demeanor of someone who's decided your future for you before even speaking. They're not here to persuade this time. They're here to collect. The conversation is short, almost courteous. You're reminded that the order needs veterans, that you'll be among brothers, that this campaign will be swift, decisive, blessed. You keep your mouth shut because you know the words you want to say, about the sand in your teeth, the stink of men packed too tightly in siege lines, the way the sun in the Levant feels like it's burning through to your marrow. Will sound like blasphemy here. You nod. Not yes, not no. Just enough to make them leave without a scene. But that night, the decision presses heavier. You walk the village streets after dark, the frost crunching under your boots, the air sharp in your lungs. You pass homes where lamplight glows through shutters, hear muffled laughter, the creak of beds, the easy sigh of people who know where they'll be tomorrow. You used to want that. Now it feels like a life someone else deserves. The next morning, you make your real attempt. It's market day, and the crowd is thick enough to hide in. You slip between stalls, lingering near the smithy, losing yourself in the smell of hot iron and the rhythmic clang of the hammer. When you spot the Templar quartermaster across the square, you duck into an alley and keep moving until the noise of the market fades behind you. You take the long road out toward the woods, telling yourself you're just walking for air, just stretching your legs. But the truth is heavier. You're thinking about disappearing, slipping into another town, changing your name, becoming some nameless laborer stacking grain sacks for a living. A man who was never a crusader. A man who owes nothing to anyone. The fantasy doesn't last long. The sound of hooves again, this time closer, sharper against the frozen ground. You keep walking, slower now, as if you can somehow dissolve into the bare trees. But the road bends, and there they are. 2 mounted sergeants in the livery of the order, blocking the way like they'd been waiting for you, which they probably had. The conversation is different this time. No talk of honor or duty, just a reminder of the oath and the penalties for desertion. You try to joke, make it light, but your voice doesn't land right. They don't smile. One dismounts, hands you a rolled parchment with the official seal. Your summons, written as if you'd already agreed. Reporting date, location, and instructions for securing your gear. There's no room for reply. It's not a letter, it's a tether. They leave you standing there, the road stretching empty in both directions, the wind cutting through your cloak. You walk back to the village slower this time, because you understand now. The choice was never yours. It never really was. Not since the first day you put on that white mantle. You've been carrying the summons for years. It just hadn't been delivered yet. In the days that follow, you go through the motions. You oil your sword, mend the weak spots in your hauberk, check the straps on your shield. The work feels automatic, like the muscle memory of a man who never truly came home. You pack light. There's no point pretending this will be comfortable. A few changes of linen, the wooden cross you've carried since your first campaign, the dagger you keep hidden under your cloak for the moments you don't speak of. The villagers treat you differently now. Some nod in respect, others in pity, a few in quiet relief that it's you going and not their sons. You don't blame them. You wouldn't choose this life for anyone else either. The night before you leave, you sit by the fire in the tanner's shop, the smell of leather and smoke wrapping around you like a shroud. You think about the road ahead, about the ports, the ships, the endless horizon, about the heat, the dust, the siege walls, about the possibility that you won't come back this time, and the faint, treacherous whisper in your mind that says, maybe that's fine. You sleep poorly. The dreams are loud, clashing steel, shouts in languages you half understand, the snap of banners in a wind that smells of blood and salt. When you wake, it's still dark, and you realize the journey has already begun, even if your boots haven't touched the road yet. By dawn, the village gathers to see you off. The air is crisp, the frost thick on the grass. The Templar escort waits at the edge of the square, horses steaming in the cold. You shoulder your pack, adjust the sword belt, and offer no farewell speeches. Words feel useless now. As you mount up and turn toward the road, you catch sight of a boy in the crowd, wooden sword in hand, eyes wide with the kind of admiration that only survives in those who've never seen real war. You almost tell him to throw the toy away, to play at something else, but you don't. You ride out, the village shrinking behind you, the sound of hooves swallowing the silence and the knowledge settling in like a truth you've known all along. You were never really done. The ship is the same as every ship bound for the Holy Land, wooden, cramped, perpetually damp, and smelling of a mixture that somehow contains both the rot of spoiled grain and the sharp tang of salt water, with just enough unwashed human musk to remind you that you're in good company, if by good you mean loud, smelly, and very possibly contagious. You try to keep to yourself in the corner of the lower deck, knees pulled up under your chin, because that's the only way to make the space yours. but every swell of the sea shifts you into someone else's ribs or knees or feet, and the muttered curses rise and fall like the tide. Days blur into nights, nights blur into days, and you discover that hunger, boredom, and seasickness make a sort of trinity you'd happily see excommunicated. You tell yourself the voyage will be over soon, and you try to picture the stone walls of Acre or the dusty roads to Jerusalem, but the visions slide away, replaced by the repetitive slap of waves and the groaning of the timbers above your head. You start counting the knots in the planks to distract yourself, but you lose count around 73 when a rat decides your boot looks like a promising cave. When the coast finally appears, it's almost a surprise. You'd half convinced yourself the ship would just circle endlessly until the wood rotted beneath your feet. The cry goes up, men push to the rails, and there's the shoreline. Brown, sun-blasted, utterly indifferent to your arrival. You disembark into a heat so sudden and thick it feels like walking into a bread oven, and the air has that same faint burn of dust that will coat your teeth by the end of the first hour. You join the column heading inland, armour clanking, water sloshing in skins that never seem full enough. Around you, the chatter is half anticipation, half complaint, men talking about loot, about glory, about sins they'll confess if they live long enough to see a confessional again. You keep your own counsel because you've learned the hard way that talking about survival before the first skirmish is like whistling in a storm, useless and vaguely offensive to the forces that could kill you. The first engagement comes sooner than you'd like. A raid on the supply line, a sudden clash in a wadi you'd thought was empty, the screaming chaos of arrows hissing out of nowhere. You draw steel before you've even thought about it, the weight of the sword familiar in your grip, the heat already pooling in your helmet. The fight is short, sharp, over before your mind catches up, and you're left staring at a man on the ground, his eyes still open, flies already circling, his blood turning the dust to something sticky. You close his eyes with your gauntlet because it feels like the thing to do, but you don't linger. There's no pause here, no moment of silence, just the next march. Weeks pass like this. March, fight, march again. The dust becomes a part of you, working into your skin, your lungs, your thoughts. You eat when there's food, drink when there's water, sleep when you can, and you stop expecting any of those things to arrive on schedule. You stop writing letters home because you've realized they're more for you than for the people who might read them. And the act of pretending to care about news from the village feels like a luxury you can't afford in the middle of all this. And yet, there are moments, tiny, stolen moments, that don't feel like war. The night you sit under the stars with two other veterans, sharing a skin of sour wine and talking about nothing at all. The afternoon, you help patch a saddle, and the young squire thanks you like you've saved his life. The rare morning when the air is cool and the sun hasn't yet burned the world white, and you let yourself believe you might see the end of this campaign. But campaigns end the way seasons end, not in a single day, but in the slow accumulation of moments when you realize the shape of things has changed. The sieges grow less frequent, the enemy less visible. Orders start to talk about withdrawal, about securing what's been taken, about acceptable losses. You ride through towns that once spat at you and now eye you warily, like a storm cloud that might yet drift back. When the recall comes, you don't cheer. You just start packing, because you've learned that joy is as dangerous as despair out here. The march back to the coast feels longer, though the path is the same, and the sight of the ship waiting in harbour is less relief and more inevitability. The voyage home is slower, rougher, the sea less forgiving, your patience thinner. Back in Europe, the air feels different, thicker, colder, full of smells you'd forgotten. Wet earth, wood smoke, the faint sweetness of hay. You return to the village smaller somehow, not in size, but in place, like a piece of furniture set back into a room that's been rearranged. People greet you, some with warmth, some with awkward distance. You find your hands twitching for sword hilt or shield strap when all you're holding is a loaf of bread. You try to resume the old rhythms, work, market, church, but the days have too much space in them, and the nights are crowded with sounds only you can hear. You don't talk about the heat, the dust, the sieges. You talk about the stars, the wine, the way the desert smells after rain. You let them think it was all some grand adventure because the truth wouldn't fit in their ears. Time passes. You age into it, like a suit of mail rusting gently in a corner. The scars fade to white, the aches settle into your bones, the memories soften at the edges. You watch younger men leave for their first campaigns, their eyes bright, their armor shining, and you know they'll return looking a little more like you, or not at all. You say nothing, because they wouldn't listen. And when the next call comes, and it always comes, you're not surprised. You're tired maybe, but not surprised. You think about the sea, the dust, the fights in narrow streets, and you feel that familiar tightening in your chest. Not fear, not exactly, but the knowledge that the wheel is turning again, and you're still tied to it. You could refuse, you suppose, fade into the background, let the order forget you. But you know better. You've known since the first time you rode out under their banner that this was never something you could put down. It's not a mantle you wear. It's a mark burned into you, invisible to most, but as plain as a torch to those who know how to look. So you do what you've always done. You shoulder the pack, tighten the straps, and step back into the current. Because the crusade is not just a war, not just a place. It's the shape of your life now, the rhythm of your breath, the measure of your years. And as the road stretches ahead, you let the irony curl in your mind like smoke, that a man can fight for decades in the name of God and still not know if God ever noticed. That the victories are as temporary as the graves you dug in foreign soil, that the only thing you truly carry home each time is yourself, heavier, quieter, and still not entirely sure why you keep coming back. You ride out again, the hoofbeats steady, the sky wide, the horizon as empty and as full as it's ever been.